Okay, welcome back to another episode of Vital Descent. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 255. Show notes may be found at vitaldescent.com/255. And today I'm really glad to be joined by Ted Carpenter. He is, I believe now, Ted, you're a senior fellow at the Libertarian Institute. But did you also want to just introduce yourself to the audience?
Well, I've had a 37-year career dealing with U.S. foreign policy, which is a severe punishment for anyone, having to try to improve that wretched record. I was with the Cato Institute for those 37 years, and I have now joined the Libertarian Institute and the Randolph Bourne Institute as a senior fellow. And I feel that those organizations are much more committed to a peaceful, non-interventionist foreign policy than my previous employer.
Yeah, and like I was saying before we went on, we're really glad to have you. And I know antiwar.com feels the same way as well. And in a way, it was a bit difficult. I mean, I have been focusing mostly on China for the last couple of years, but when you've covered so many topics, it's difficult to narrow one down. But I'll start with the one I'm more familiar with, at least. And I had asked you specifically because you wrote about, you said 18 years ago now, America's coming war with China, a collision course over Taiwan. And of course, now that seems really prescient because of everything that's been going on with Taiwan, especially since Nancy Pelosi visited in August. But I guess just to start out, what made you write that book at that time?
I was noticing the increasingly uncompromising positions adopted by both Washington and Beijing with respect to Taiwan. I thought the crisis would come earlier, but the election of the Kuomintang government in Taiwan in 2008 and the re-election of President Ma Ying-jeou in 2012 delayed the process, but I think we're seeing a resumption of it. And it's clear the United States has embarked on a thinly disguised containment policy against China. Taiwan is the centerpiece of that policy. And there's little question that there is extensive bipartisan support for a hardline policy toward Beijing and ever stronger support for Taiwan. We're getting some of the same rhetoric about Taiwan being this vibrant democracy that we've heard with respect to Ukraine. At least with Taiwan, it has some connection to reality. With Ukraine, it does not. But still, the danger of a U.S.-China military collision over Taiwan is very real, and the consequences would be extremely bad indeed. Could be catastrophic.
And one thing I really narrowed in on, in reading your book, and the part that was most useful for me was the background, kind of getting into this topic and learning about the history of it. But it seems that Taiwan has always been at the center of U.S.-China relations, at least for the last, at least since the end of World War II, when Taiwan was returned to China. And do you know, what is it about this island that just makes it such a quagmire for U.S.-China relations?
Well, it does have a strategic location. It is kind of the anchor of the so-called first island chain. Whichever power controls Taiwan controls China's naval exits to the Pacific. Obviously, the government of Beijing wants to control that first island chain. The United States is determined not to let China achieve that ability. It began in the early Cold War period when the Kuomintang, the nationalist government, lost the Civil War on the mainland. President Harry Truman decided to send the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait to prevent communist forces from going from the mainland to take over Taiwan. And we have been in somewhat of a frozen stature ever since. President Nixon moved to begin the normalization of relations with Beijing, but the U.S. commitment to Taiwan has never wavered all that much. And once Taiwan did adopt a democratic system, you didn't have the old Kuomintang dictatorship with Chiang Kai-shek and his son. Public support in the United States increased noticeably. So you have a combination of a number of factors. Public support here in this country for hardline policy, the military-industrial complex seeing Taiwan as an arena for massive arms sales, and a justification for ever bigger air and naval budgets for the United States military. That's a powerful network of interests.
Oh, certainly. And what you had mentioned, the strategic importance of Taiwan itself. There's been a lot said too about China's emotional attachment to the island as being, China being a nation that's primarily has been concerned with colonialism in a way, in combating colonialism and being its own country, whether it's from the West or from Japan. Do you think for them it's primarily, reconstituting the island? Is it primarily a strategic concern, or is it kind of a nationalistic, emotional one in a way?
About equal portions. Chinese leaders recognize the strategic importance of Taiwan, and given Taiwan's growing economic and technological importance, after all, the island now is the principal source of the advanced forms of computer chips, the most advanced versions. So that's a huge economic and strategic prize. But one shouldn't underestimate the emotions involved. I've dealt with people, both regime representatives and people, I think, who go along with the party simply because, as many people in communist Europe did during the Soviet era, because they have to. And some of them will be pretty candid about other issues, like the South China Sea, like trade issues. But when it comes to Taiwan, there is this visceral reaction, this emotional reaction. Taiwan is the last remnant of what Chinese refer to as China's century of humiliation at the hands of outside powers. It is the last item from the standpoint of a good many people on the mainland, the last remnant, the unresolved portion of the Civil War that ended on the mainland in 1949. And when it comes to emotions that way, it is very dangerous to underestimate their importance. Americans, I don't think, fully understand just how emotional the Taiwan issue is for most Chinese.
And it's hard to really find a comparison. I tried to analogize, because one of the good things that, Ron Paul was so strong at was trying to put the shoe on the other foot, especially with, our wars in the Middle East. And it really is hard to try to find a comparison. And in some way, do you think that's a useful exercise?
In most cases, it is a very useful exercise. I've used that on people who contend, for example, that Russia had no reason to be upset about NATO moving right up to its borders. And I've flipped that. I said, how would Americans feel if, let's say, there was an alliance led by Russia or by China, and that power decided to enlarge its alliance by taking in Canada or Mexico? I don't think we would respond very well, very favorably at all. And yet we expect the Russians to have been perfectly tolerant about NATO moving right up to its borders and even taking in Ukraine, which was clearly on the table, which would give NATO a 1,500-mile additional border on Russia's doorstep. It's a very useful exercise because I think people, if they think about an issue in that fashion, they usually become much more understanding about what the other side may be thinking and why.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with you. Where I struggle though is trying to find a comparative example with the United States. I try to say, well, if Texas was an island, or something like that, and Texas had seceded from the United States, but they were being, I don't know, threatened by an outside power or something like that.
I think about the closest analogy we have is in the immediate aftermath of the American War for Independence. After all, there was an effort on the part of U.S. forces, colonial forces, to take over Quebec.
Right.
And that failed narrowly. And there were a good many Americans who felt that British held territory in Canada was unfinished business. That was a factor in the War of 1812. It wasn't just naval abuses by the British in the Atlantic. That was probably the proximate cause. But there was some land hunger and a desire to expel Britain from North America. And I think we're seeing something similar with China and Taiwan, that this would push U.S. hegemony back rather substantially from China's doorstep, and it would resolve a very emotional issue with respect to Chinese history.
So whenever anyone studies this for any point in time, they're going to come into the joint communiques and the six assurances,
yes,
and the opaqueness of U.S.-China policy when it comes to Taiwan. And you comment in your book about how the joint communiques have really mystified China experts for decades, trying to figure out exactly what they mean. And I've taken a look at it, and at least for my part, I really focus on, the Shanghai Communique in 1972. There's the clause that says, the U.S. acknowledges the opinion that basically every person in Taiwan and China has, that there is but one China, and the U.S. doesn't challenge that. And I think that's the operative phrase there, that it doesn't challenge it. And then in 1979, you have the second joint communique essentially says, well, there is one China. We're going to reincorporate everything we agreed in 72. There's one China, and it has one legitimate government that's in Beijing. But at least by, I don't know, in reading it, you would assume that one China includes Taiwan, because we had said that in the first joint communique. Is that a bad, unfair reading of those documents?
The 72 communique was a masterpiece in diplomatic finesse. The United States did not say that it recognized that Taiwan was part of China. It said that people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait assert there is but one China. That has been what has changed so dramatically. A majority of Taiwanese, a rather large majority of Taiwanese, do not believe that Taiwan is part of China. They have no desire to rejoin the mainland, especially as long as the mainland is under the rule of a communist government. But I've been amazed at the Taiwanese I've spoken to over the past decade and a half or so, because particularly we go out to dinner and drinks. I would ask them candidly, would Taiwan be willing to rejoin the mainland if it had a Western-style, more or less democratic government? And to my surprise, the majority of the Taiwanese I talked to said no. That Taiwan would then be just one province in this gigantic country. It would be the most prosperous province. Therefore, it would be the cash cow for Beijing in terms of taxes. and Taiwanese would not be able to run their own affairs the way they can now. So the prevailing assumption with the 1972 communique is no longer valid. And that poses a big dilemma, because that means that the United States has a client that is determined to maintain its independence, even at the cost of a military clash between the United States and China. And we have to ask ourselves if we're willing to take that kind of risk and pay the potential cost, the potential sacrifice that would be entailed in defending Taiwan from Beijing's efforts to reincorporate it into a unified Chinese state.
Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of two. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there, a flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker, really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldescent.com/stitchfix. You can also get Vital Descent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Descent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldescent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel, and I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldescent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at @PatMcFarland_, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. Yeah, and I often wonder, because I'm limited in my ability to collect the actual, on the ground opinion of the Taiwanese people. And I certainly, I sympathize with their plight in that situation, because, as someone who lives in a rural area in Wisconsin, for me, it would be better if we could make our own decisions locally. There's the localism, decentralized argument there. And I could certainly understand why a small province wouldn't want to be lost in the array of, a massive state like China.
Yeah, and the public opinion polls have shown a very dramatic trend. It used to be a majority of Taiwanese identified themselves as either primarily Chinese or the hedging position, both Chinese and Taiwanese. Now the overwhelming majority regard themselves as Taiwanese. And the identification as Chinese is now a very small minority.
So what do you make then of the Kuomintang kind of sweeping the local elections in the last cycle?
The Kuomintang victory is largely due to local factors, also economic factors. The discontent with the current government is fairly substantial. All countries go through these cycles. There seems to be gradual public annoyance with whichever party is in power for any significant length of time. And I think that's what we're seeing here. If one looks at the Kuomintang leadership, though, they backed away from the commitment to reunification at some point. That they've understood, I think, that that's a political loser as far as Taiwanese opinion is concerned. So Beijing is likely to be disappointed, even if the Kuomintang regains power. They're not going to have as cordial relationship as they did between 2008 and 2016 with Ma Ying-jeou. And if they're expecting that, they're going to be very disappointed. And that will probably raise tensions even more if they feel, well, we got the Democratic Progressive Party out of power, and now we're dealing with the Kuomintang government again. And, oh, wait a minute, they're not being all that cooperative either. That begins to remove the last hope that they might have for a negotiated reunification, for peaceful reunification.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. And do you think that the resurgence of the Kuomintang has anything to do with a popular rejection of the DPP's policy of at least having Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy and all these diplomatic visits?
The Taiwanese people are somewhat nervous about that. Again, they want to maintain de facto independence. They would love to have legal recognition of independence and be fully recognized by countries around the world. But the current situation is satisfactory to them. They don't want somebody taking provocative actions that could trigger a crisis with the mainland and the possible use of military force against Taiwan. So some of the deep green people, the extreme pro-independence types in the Democratic Progressive Party, worry them. They're also worried that U.S. officials, in their usual clumsiness, don't understand the nuances. So Pelosi's visit was, in some ways, emotionally satisfying for them, but they also understood that really provoked Beijing, and that was not a good thing. I think if they could be sure of a Kuomintang government that would stand up to Beijing, but not go out of its way to provoke the authorities there, that would probably be their preference at the moment. And they would reject either the pro-unification crowd to the extent it still exists, and it's pretty small, and they would reject the more extreme elements in the Democratic Progressive Party.
I think that leads us pretty naturally into this topic of strategic ambiguity, because I think, my reading of it, of course, I'm a non-interventionist Ron Paul type, but I do recognize that strategic ambiguity has more or less kept the peace across the strait for, since 1979. What are your thoughts, first off, on strategic ambiguity? And second off, do you believe that the Biden administration has renounced that policy? Maybe not actually officially doing it, but at least actions speaking louder than words.
I would say the policy of strategic ambiguity has probably used up most of its utility, its usefulness. Biden's statements, even though his subordinates typically walk them back as much as they can, and made it pretty clear that there is no strategic ambiguity anymore. And I've written a couple of articles on that point, that given the bipartisan atmosphere in Congress, combined with Biden's own preferences, the United States has a de facto commitment now to come to Taiwan's aid if Beijing uses force. And I don't think our foreign policy, defense policy gurus have really examined the probable consequences of that. China has been preparing for the last 2 decades to neutralize Washington's ability to intervene militarily to defend Taiwan. And I don't know if they're quite there yet. I certainly underestimated the amount of time it would take to reach that kind of strategic parity with the United States in terms of air and naval power in the Western Pacific. But I think China is very close at this point. And looking out, say, 5 years to 10 years, it would be dicey at a minimum for the United States to intervene. In fact, there have been war games conducted by a variety of think tanks and the Pentagon itself that show it is at best a toss-up at the moment whether the United States would win a war against China over Taiwan without the United States escalating to the use of nuclear weapons. And that is terrifying. I don't think any rational person wants to go down that path.
Yeah, certainly not. I'm just trying to look at some of the. So you've also written a piece about how, the great thing about at least Kissinger and Nixon at the time opening up with China was to kind of drive a wedge between China and Russia, or at least take advantage of the Sino-Soviet split and open that up and kind of turn China away from the Soviet influence. Now, your piece has kind of written about how the United States has driven those two countries together. And could you explain that a little bit?
The Nixon-Kissinger approach was pretty effective, pretty subtle within the context of the overall U.S. Cold War policy. We should have had a very different policy toward Russia in the post-Cold War era. That was not done, either through clumsiness or deliberate provocation. Members of the military-industrial complex seemed to seek a confrontation with Russia, to hem Russia in, to humiliate that country whenever possible. The effect of that has been to give Russia and China a common cause, a common enemy, the United States. Now, this took extraordinary ineptitude on the part of U.S. policymakers to drive two countries that have so many differences between themselves on so many issues. But we have given them a common adversary. So they're willing to subordinate those potential quarrels and conflicts to stand firm against the United States to prevent U.S. hegemony. And even from the standpoint of a hardline policy toward China, wanting to contain China, this was an incredibly counterproductive move, because one of the building blocks of that containment policy needed to be Russia. You start thinking about the major actors that could constrain China. You're talking about Japan, you're talking about India, you're talking about Russia first and foremost. The others are secondary players. They might want to restrain Chinese power, but most of them don't have the wherewithal to make much of a contribution. Those three powers do. And in fact, the United States could very much draw back and let them on their own contain Chinese power to the extent that they believe it is necessary for the benefit of their own interests. We have now made all of that extremely difficult.
And that leads perfectly into my final question, which is kind of, again, me coming from a Ron Paul non-interventionist standpoint and being a bit, I will say, of an idealist. I also recognize that there's, things happening in geopolitics that are beyond my ken and the reality of the situation. But if we were to de-escalate this situation, could you identify some concrete things that the United States could do to help that?
Well, the Taiwan issue is going to be almost intractable unless the United States caves to China on that issue. But there are other things that we could do to improve the bilateral relationship with Beijing. And among them would be stopping the escalation of the trade disputes, at least being more receptive to Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea, not necessarily recognizing them all, but at least being more receptive to a compromise. You have the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands in the East China Sea, very sensitive, under the control of Japan. The United States first asserted it was neutral and now is clearly tilted toward Japan. That infuriated Beijing. That might be a place to backtrack a bit and perhaps placate Beijing on that issue. So there are ways to at least prevent the current tensions between China and the United States from reaching the point of an armed confrontation, which would be disastrous for both countries. I don't see U.S. officials making the slightest move to do any of that, however. And that is trouble. That is very trouble.
And the reason why I keep trying to qualify this is because, if I were in charge, I would stop selling weapons to Taiwan and I would, try to break some of these military alliances. But I mean, that's just not really, realistic unless I'm mistaken about that. At least dialing back weapons sales and stop parading your diplomats into Taiwan. Any thoughts on that?
The weapons sales are very sensitive and have very strong support in Congress and with the whole military-industrial complex. The United States could, again, dial back the ostentatious show of support for Taiwan. Those visits, in terms of substance, really don't matter that much. But boy, are they of symbolic importance, especially as far as the Chinese are concerned. And at least should not go out of our way to slap them across the nose, those kinds of demonstrations, those kinds of gestures. That's not helping us.
Yeah, certainly. Well, Mr. Carpenter, I really appreciate you coming on today, and I really appreciate your time. Hopefully we can do this again, but I really enjoyed today's interview. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.